लकड़ी और मिट्टी और ईंट। दजी दीवारी है ना, वो भी है, ताक का घर भी है। जो यहाँ का पुराना कारीगर है उसी ने बनाया, मेरा दादा ने। उसने यही सीखा कश्मीरी में। इधर हमारे पास एक घर पुराना था, इस वक्त भी मौजूद है।
Kashmir in that sense is one of the only few places in the world, and not just in the country, that is so layered and multifaceted. Nature has always served as the basic inspiration for any Kashmiri karigar. So you would see seasons being reflected in that, you would see floral motifs being reflected in that. I think it's really to do with the soil, and the people here, they really have the ability and the gift to be able to work with their hands. Growing up in Kashmir has deeply impacted my intellectual curiosity. The seasons have taught me changing colors, and the mountains have taught me scale. So I feel all those ideas amalgamated for me here in this experimental studio that I created as a working space. And if you talk about Zoon Gash, the word itself means moonlight. So Zoon means moon in Kashmiri, and even my name means the first ray of light that comes after darkness. So I was very deeply inclined to have a name which is contextual and something that I can relate to. So Srinagar, like you see, Jhelum is the spine of the city. The Jhelum cuts through the city in a serpentine fashion. And then the settlement started taking place on the upper right banks of the river Jhelum. It grew in a linear fashion, and then it moved on to the other part of the river Jhelum. And these two banks were then connected by these series of bridges. So we had these 7 bridges initially. So Srinagar is in Zone 5 earthquake zone. So all the structures that you see are earthquake resistant structures that are built. We do see a lot of sun-dried bricks being used. We see a lot of timber being employed in the structural systems. But if you talk about majorly the two main styles that were used for construction of these vernacular structures were Tak and Dhaji Diwali. And my fascination with the old city only started growing like when I was in like the 3rd year of my architecture school. So I've been frequenting that area a lot. So this is a model that my students made this semester. If you see, this is actually pretty much the typical layout of a Kashmiri house. And this is actually an actual house has been taken for this, making the model here. So typically what you would see is you would have your thick, about 18 inches wall. These niches that would get generated inside would also qualify as interesting sitting spaces. To partition the interior spaces, you would have something of a wooden partition here. And which is called a varusi, and you have these stackable divisions here. You can actually remove the stackable elements and they can completely like come out here. So in terms of the ornamentation, you would have this entirely done in plaster here. In like many of the columns, you would see ornamentation done. So you would see irises, typically you would see a lot of the lotus flowers here. I started getting familiarized with the network of people who were demolishing these houses and started collecting a lot of these windows and doors actually. I was very interested in learning how to refurbish a lot of this wood. So that has been a very fascinating experience. So the window that you see right here behind me, I bought many years ago and it has undergone these processes. This is stained glass from the original window that we managed to restore. In this case, I've used them as structural members. So on this side, actually, I've just like completely left it exposed and it just has a stain. And on the exterior, I actually had to paint it because it wasn't as well preserved. So actually, funnily enough, the place we're sitting at was actually a greenhouse. So this foundation existed. And I thought because these windows are lying around, I thought maybe I should just enclose it from all sides and it could just be a small room to work out of. But I was also keen on experimenting a little with the structural elements as well. So what I started doing is for this wall that you see here entirely, it's entirely done in Dhaji Diwali. It's a rectangular space and then you have the Dhaji Diwali wall, which is essentially taking the entire load of the sloping roof. It's a very gentle slope. If you see the bricks here as well, they are much smaller than the original bricks that you see here. So even though they don't really qualify as Maharaji bricks because they have a coarse appearance, but these are smaller and do lend it that kind of an impact. The columns that you see here are again that were repurposed. I wanted to go for a lime surkhi mortar. And even in that, I did not end up using the pointing. I just left it as is. So it almost also sometimes gives it and lends it the appearance of a coarse stone-like masonry. So if you see this sloping roof above us, it's entirely done again like in timber, and you see the exposed trusses here as well. So this 8-pointed star that you see here in the ceiling is again an element that was used very extensively in all like residential houses. We have the ceiling that deploys this method called Khatamband. So the word Khatamband means something that starts and doesn't end. And that's because you can generate seamless patterns with that Khatamband. So what happens is that essentially you have like these jigsaw puzzle-like pieces that are then intertwined into each other, just like they slide through into each other in the frame. In the center of the Khatamband, where you would have a chandelier or some sort of a light source, that's where these stars used to be there in a circular form or an 8-pointed star in the center of the room typically, to be able to highlight that as the center. In the second phase, what I'm trying to do is I like to experiment with the green roof. So in the old city, what used to happen is we used to have something that's called the burspash. So burspash means burs is the tree that's the birch tree. So the upper membrane of the birch tree is basically, it has a water resistant quality to it. So what used to happen is we used to have the slope, which was obviously a response to the snow. And then we used to put the membrane of the birch on top. And then we would have about 8 inches of soil on top of it. And then we would have like plants in it. And in fact, one of the most fascinating structures here in the old city is that Madin Sahib shrine. And it's possibly the last surviving example of a burspash. So this is the shrine that I was talking about, where it is entirely covered in a green roof on top with these irises blazing in the springtime. And I've superimposed it with my favorite painting of irises by Van Gogh, because interestingly, irises are my favorite flowers. If you look at Kashmiri architecture, there are a lot of processes that go into making the elements that you see in the interiors. And one of the most commonly used elements used to be these khanyari tiles, or the glazed ceramic tiles that you see mostly used in all the interior spaces. So I was using these tiles for a project that I was doing for somebody in Delhi for this friend of mine, and I actually sourced them from an existing source, and we reused and salvaged a lot of those tiles, and I had a requirement of more. So I vaguely knew that these tiles existed, and I wanted to commission a few more for the project. And this is when I found out that there's actually only one surviving family who's actually involved in this craft. And when I dug deeper into it, I found that there's only one surviving craftsman, because the elderly gentleman who's making these tiles, his next of kin, even they've not practiced this craft because it's not economically viable at all. Honestly, if you had to cast a craftsman in a film, Haji Saab would be it, because he's completely eccentric. It took a lot of persuasion for me to actually go and for him to be able to open up to me. And then what I started doing is that midway in the process, I thought that I'll just document it, but I got so interested in the process that I ended up learning the craft myself as well. If you have to speak to Haji Saab and ask him about, is this the right weather, or how many months more can we make the tiles for, he'll actually look outside, look at the trees and see the color of the leaves and say there is still enough moisture, left, so you can. So the kind of associations he has, he can literally look at the color of the fire and say that the tiles are going to be overburnt or they're under. There is absolutely no replacement for those kind of traditional knowledge systems, Finally, it culminated in the form of a photography exhibition that we did recently with the government support, and it was very well received. So Haji Saab is now receiving many orders, and he's a very busy man now. I think for a person like him, it was also that finally, as creative professionals and as karigars, all of us also require acknowledgement for our craft, right? So that is something that he really missed in all these years. It's not just the economic returns. all the objects that you see around me are things that I've collected from different places. There are things that have different emotional associations for me. There are things that have just a simple practical use. But I think to have all of these things in front of you laid out in this space is actually just an extension of your personality. I like to do a lot of work with my hand. This entire winter I actually spent redoing this map of old Delhi. It was so fascinating to see like how the city has actually evolved. So each and every part that you see here is like hand drawn. And the other thing that most people know my work through is the series of collages that I do that are called Houses of Kashmir, where I am photographing parts and segments of the old city that I encounter on my walk. So depending upon the kind of mood or the mind space that I'm in, you will find a Rekha walking in the alleys of downtown. You would find a Kashmiri woman juxtaposed against a beautiful house with a zoomed up in front of it, or even like elements like the changing colors of the chinar superimposed against Botticelli. So I think this is a very cathartic experience for me, and I think like it really amalgamates a lot of the experiences that I've had in the old city. Since this whole notion of vocal for local, I think that is something that architects can really push through. And if you educate your clients, mostly they are like really receptive to these ideas and they're willing to incorporate these things. Yeah. Anything that you see in any design element or the motifs in different parts of the country are derived from nature. The way the seasons are described, the way the colors are described in poetry, for instance. If you see paintings, symbolic associations also play such an important role. So that I feel is completely missing, and that has to do with the way architecture is taught in our country. It's a very westernized type of an education system. So I think architecture, like the arts, is something that does not exist without patronage. It does require some sort of patronage. So of course there has to be some sort of an involvement in that sense. But I think to begin with, I think if people respond to all of these things differently, and I think if they're able to establish a connection with their sense of identity, and I think generally we have to connect to our past at a more deeper and independent and individual level. Only then can these things sustain. Otherwise, it's just going to be something that existed, and it's not going to be very long before all of this fades into the dust.